Another day, another moral panic about transgender people. But this one was different, because this one happened because people actually read a book. I know, making you read the true horrific agenda of transgender people. But seriously, if you were perusing trans Twitter a few weeks ago, which I understand why you wouldn't be given Twitter's new, Musk, let's just say. But if you were, you would have seen that many TERFs were upset, and this time for more than the fact that a trans person was publicly visible. Indeed, the current moral panic surrounded this book, Manhunt by Gretchen Felker-Martin, and already by the cover, you can tell we're in for a good time.
In this review of Manhunt, anyone with enough sense can see the misogyny and sickness. Okay, I finished the book, took 3 days, by far one of the worst books I've ever read, and not even because of its writer's clear mental illness, which NPR called brilliant. There are multiple reasons to spit on Manhunt, doesn't matter if you're left or right.
Very normal for NPR to praise a book where JK Rowling, checks notes, dies in an inferno. I don't know what that voice was.
Manhunt's world is similar to the one you'd see in the comic book Y: The Last Man, a sort of gender apocalypse. Gen-cyclops. Except for in this gender apocalypse, we're introduced to a world where anyone with a certain amount of testosterone turns into feral cannibalistic monsters, sort of like the rage zombies in 28 Days Later, World War Z, or American Shoppers on Black Friday. What's left after this is a world populated mostly by cisgender women, non-binary folks, transgender men, and a few transgender women who manage to keep their testosterone levels down through various means. Sadly, one of them isn't by watching Birds of Prey on repeat, but still.
Meeting's over.
The story focuses on two trans women, Beth and Fran, as well as an indigenous trans man, Robbie, and a cis woman of color, Dr. Indy, as they struggle to survive in this world, while also dealing with a group of authoritarian TERFs hell-bent on killing trans people just as aggressively as the testosterone monsters are. Now, hearing that description, I can bet that you think you know why TERFs might be upset at this novel. But I'm here to tell you, they weren't upset at it for the reason you'd think. So, because there's no more ringing endorsement for me to read a book that I'm moral panic around it, I decided to pick it up. And I found it to honestly be a profoundly insightful read that challenged me on multiple levels. First, for its over-the-top gore and purposefully disgusting description of this horrific gender apocalypse, but more so, once I got past that, its raw honesty about the fears and anxieties that define not only trans people's lives, but also a surprising empathy and understanding for so-called gender-critical feminists, or TERFs, as well, despite their anger at this novel. It's a book about monsters, but not the monsters of the testosterone zombies that it depicts, nor the cliched Walking Dead line that the real monsters are the other humans around us. No, the novel is about something deeper than that. The novel is about the monsters that we see inside of others, and in ourselves, without realizing that the monster that we see is actually only really in our head. It's a novel about how trans people are told to see our own bodies as rotten, mutated, and gross, and how TERFs see an even darker monster inside of us, ready to transform and burst out, ready to kill and bite and claw, without realizing the truth that lies underneath all of us. That instead of a dark creature, there lies a human being. So, let's discuss what this book actually has to say, and why TERF's anger seems so blind to the heart of the book in front of them. So I want to focus first on the controversy from TERFs around the novel before we get into the novel itself, because I know why you're here. You like discussing a little controversy. It gets all the clicks. That's what all the fun's about. But also, I do actually want to start here because talking about how TERFs view the novel and their misinterpretations and deliberate misconstructions of it will naturally lead to discussing how the story understands and articulates their worldview within the world's fiction, and how it's critical of it, and yet empathetic of it at the same time. The best place to begin, I think, is to discuss an article written by Julie Bindel, which articulated most of the TERF criticism of the book. And we'll talk a little bit more about who Julie Bindel is in a little bit, but for now, just know that she is a self-proclaimed gender-critical feminist. After spending the first part of her article insulting the novel's writing without actually saying anything about why she thinks it's bad, she then takes a hard left turn to talking about JK Rowling. Actually, more what she's doing is like simping for JK Rowling.
JK Rowling is someone who cares about people on the bottom rung of the ladder, whatever their creed or sexuality, and she uses her wealth, privilege, and power to their benefit. TERF is shorthand for trans-exclusionary radical feminist, the highly derogatory term used by trans rights activists for anyone, but almost exclusively women, who insist that biological sex is real. I am among them, while the term is also repeatedly used against Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling for her passionate defense of this fundamental principle.
And they say we're obsessed with her. So we're already like 4 paragraphs into Bindel's article, and we still have not discussed the actual contents of the book yet, and Bindel has to do this because she has to frame the entire argument that she's placing this novel within her own terms. And she does this by misrepresenting the central crux of the argument between trans people and TERFs, which is a common tactic by TERFs. TERFs often like to argue that, first and foremost, they're not saying anything wrong. They're actually fighting for trans people and TERFs. Excuse me, women. The conflation of TERFdom and all women is a central component of this that we'll get into in a bit. But they're just saying that all they're arguing is biological sex is real. That's just all they're saying. That's all they're doing, nothing more than that. And for that, they get attacked and harassed. Back in reality, though, no one's actually disagreeing with them on biology. I and most trans people acknowledge that biological sex is real. More so, we're often hyper aware of biology and how it affects us in our day-to-day lives. Why do you think some trans people who seek medical transition, like myself, use things like hormone replacement therapy or surgeries? Because we think biology doesn't affect us? But this is how many TERFs and people deliberately trying to misconstrue what trans people are saying, like Gold Old Tucky C here, have to frame their argument. That they are just fighting for reality and that trans people are delusional.
Genetics are real, maybe unfortunately, but doesn't change the truth of it.
Because by doing so, before they even discuss the issue at hand, they've already framed trans people as less cogent, out of touch, hysterical. Hysterical. Huh, that word has etymology in stuff. I wouldn't think about it too much. But this framing places TERFs and Rowling in Bindel's argument as objectively correct and being attacked for just stating facts, when that's not actually the case. After doing this though, we finally get to Bindel's actual criticism with the novel. You see, within the novel's fictional post-apocalypse, we learn that as the world has become more testosterone-fueled than a Zack Snyder movie, a fictional version of J.K. Rowling, who is a millionaire, hired military contractors and had them protect her in her castle in Scotland. One of these clumsy contractors knocked over a lamp and caused an explosion that caused Rowling, quote,
to burn alive, and finally the whole castle collapsed.
Yeah, pretty fucking dark, huh? Well, that's what you get for using candelabras. But anyways, these 3 sentences of world building within the novel was Bindel's leading criticism of the entire book.
Now, Felker-Martin has apparently seen fit to exact a deeply unpleasant fictional revenge depicting the successful writer's gruesome death after being crushed by a burnt-out castle. I will not dignify Felker-Martin's underwhelming prose with any further detailed description, save to say that it is full of misogynistic bile.
This criticism, which sparked TERF rage faster than a trans woman needing to use the public restroom after downing a Gatorade with her at a sporting event, argued that Fletcher-Martin was trying to harass, attack, and incite violence against Rowling and all TERFs in real life. That interpretation of this passage is profoundly illuminating to how TERFs view many things written and discussed by trans people on many levels. So we're honestly going to have to pause here to really analyze why. But keep in mind, these are 3 sentences of the novel.
All of us, including JK Rowling, have spoken out in support of gender non-conforming people. Indeed, having had the privilege of getting to know her in recent years, I can testify that she is the loveliest and most humane of people, with a heart as big as a country. Her reward? To be hounded, villainized, and now fictionally crushed to death to the delight of her blinkered, hate-filled detractors. The very worst thing is that the people who peddle this hatred and misogyny know the truth. They are quite aware that J.K. Rowling isn't bigoted and that she is not the demon that they claim she is. Instead, it is a convenient label used to silence her because she's a feminist who speaks out about male violence.
So once again, Bindel reiterates her description of herself and other gender-critical feminists as these great pillars of virtue who have fought for all rights, including those of trans people, and now face harassment as a result. Don't they understand how much we're doing for them? Now, jokes aside, I do want to be very, very clear here. There is a kernel of truth in Bindel's depiction of how they, TERFs, and women in general, have been attacked. J.K. Rowling and many women, just online in general, face a lot of abuse, sexism, harassment, and misogyny targeted at them. And sometimes it's just for being women publicly, and sometimes it's for being prominent feminists trying to fight for women's issues. We see this in all fields when women, cis or trans, try to speak up about issues that affect our rights, regardless of a trans context or not. Think of how women speaking up for equal pay or speaking up against laws that target women often face more targeted harassment. And this usually does come from a place of misogyny that is ubiquitous within our culture today. And Rowling herself specifically has been open about receiving death threats, which I'm sure is true. But the issue here is how TERFs frame this harassment and abuse and sexism targeted at them. Because, one, they flatten all these attacks as only coming from trans people and our allies, which isn't true, it comes from all sectors. And then they take that and argue, two, that only harassment is coming from trans people and our allies. That there's nothing else, no other things that we're saying, we're just coming at them with harassment, abuse, and death threats. That's it, that's all that trans people have to offer when we talk about TERFs. And that we do this, that we target them with harassment because, just cause, apparently. I mean, Bindel said it herself. We know the truth. Rowling isn't bigoted. We just attack simply because, I don't know, we're waiting for the next Fallout New Vegas sequel, so we need to use our time somewhere, I guess. This is how TERFs always discuss trans people, that we just attack them because we want to, because we're men trying to target misogyny at them. But in this specific case, Bindel is taking Fletcher Martin's description of her fictional Rowling as a specific representation of these types of misogynistic attacks on her and TERFs like her. But the thing is, that's not true. The novel isn't simply being vindictive, as Bindel is arguing. The story has an articulate criticism to make of Rowling. The usage of Rowling in this story is twofold. The first was to highlight how she, Rowling, a millionaire, would be able to isolate herself from the horrors of the apocalyptic world around her in the novel. This, by the way, isn't exactly a wildly radical depiction of billionaires in post-apocalyptic fiction, but it is a time-honored one. Post-apocalyptic fiction is littered with stories of billionaires being able to insulate themselves from the harm that they cause. And fiction does this because in the real world, many billionaires do this already. Many billionaires have built doomsday bunkers to protect themselves in case of nuclear war or climate change, potential apocalypses that they themselves caused. Or even removing it from a post-apocalyptic idea mindset, we could simply discuss how billionaires created our current poverty-stricken world of today that they themselves are insulated from by being billionaires. So Rowling in Manhunt being able to hide herself in a castle away from the testosterone zombies is what is called a metaphor. But this isn't just about billionaires in general. It's about Rowling specifically, because it's a criticism that Rowling herself threw into stark relief. On April 10th of this year, Rowling had a lovely brunch with prominent members of Get the L Out, a group that, quote, stands against transgenderism, in their own words. Get the L Out is a specifically anti-transgender group that has worked to push transphobic legislation and also spreads fear-mongering about trans people, most notably in a controversial article published by the BBC titled, "We're Being Pressured into Sex by Some Trans Women," which the great YouTuber Sean went into further detail in this video. So check that out if you haven't heard about that. Not a great organization. Yet this casual brunch with Rowling and the L Out fam gang was framed by them as this big victory for women. Ah yes, pork sausages and mojitos, truly a victory for women everywhere. Yet, that same exact day, more than 3,000 people took to the streets to demand that the United Kingdom government include trans people in its new conversion therapy ban law. Something that it had abjectly refused to do, despite considerable evidence that conversion therapy is deeply harmful to anyone who goes through it, trans or not. The original law that banned conversion therapy in the United Kingdom did include trans people initially, but was campaigned against by many groups, including Get the L Out. So while Rowling and friends got to have an excellent women's brunch in a fancy restaurant, trans people and our allies had to take to the streets to fight the harm that exact same group of brunchers helped to enact. So the book's depiction of Rowling holding up in a castle during the TERFocalypse and claiming that it was a victory for women because she was surviving feels true to actual reality. It's a worthwhile critique, not some hollow threat Bindel paints it as. This is how fiction is used to critique those in power. But this story of Rowling and her brunch friends also illuminates how hollow Bindel's depiction of Rowling using her wealth to help trans people and all women really is. Indeed, Rowling has given money to many charity organizations that help young girls, and that's great for sure. I am 100% very glad that some of the money that Rowling has garnered and earned and directed people to fund for has gone to worthwhile causes. 100%. Yet, at the same time, she, and even more, especially TERF groups like Get the L Out, have focused their money and attention and used their platform not on helping women, but to dogmatically harass and target trans people in various ways, from attempting to limit our rights, spreading misinformation about our bodies, vilifying us in the media, or constantly ranting about us every single day on Twitter. Now, I don't have time to go into the greater detail of how TERFs cause harm specifically towards trans people and how it harms everyone, not just trans people. But I did write this article for GameSpot that goes into the specifics in more depth. And then I also made this video surrounding TERF ideology and some of the harm that's caused to trans people in general. And I've also done these videos on JK Rowling, specifically on how her rhetoric has been used to target trans people. And the links are down below. But the point here is that TERFs love to say that they're innocent people not causing harm to anyone, and that trans people just wish to attack them for no reason. But we do have reasons. Certainly, do these women get harassed, death threats, and more? Yes, 100%. And while I think the predominant amount of it is the amount that any woman gets for speaking up about any issue, whether it's harmful or not, I'm also sure that some of it does come from trans people. And I have been very clear in all of my videos that I've talked about TERFs numerous times about how I personally do not approve of anyone, trans people included, harassing anybody. Critique them, yes. Fight them where we have to. Harass them, though, no. But that's the thing, though. Most trans people aren't harassing them. What they're doing is critiquing them, calling out the harm that they caused, over and over and over again. But the issue is that TERFs use this narrative that all of trans people's words against them is harassment, and use the most over-the-top examples of trans people harassing them and our allies harassing them, often men, by the way. I did this video on why I think that's wrong. If you're an ally of trans people who wants to try and help trans people, don't use misogyny to attack TERFs because it feeds their narrative. But they use those examples to flatten all critiques against them, like manhunts, as simple harassment from trans people, and wield misinformation to paint themselves, TERFs, as warriors of womanhood while they push trans people down with their harm and their rhetoric. Yet, there's also something deeper here that criticism of how Rowling has used her wealth and power has touched upon. This ability to paint valid critique and harassment with the same brush often comes from how the most prominent TERFs come from a background of economic privilege. What do I mean by this? Well, we see a great example of it as Bindel continues in her criticism of the novel Manhunt, because she goes off on some weird tangent about the publishing industry.
I know firsthand the hypocrisy of publishing houses who seem to have no problem selling books by everyone from drug dealers to murderers, and indeed delighted basking in the promotional opportunities they afford, but who draw a line at female authors who have done nothing more than speak out in support of women's sex-based rights. 2 years ago, having produced a proposal as well as a sample chapter of my book on modern feminism, I was wooed by 3 separate publishing houses, wined and dined by their representatives, and told that they were desperate to be the ones to take it to market. Yet, when they subsequently took it to their acquisitions department, all were each told the same thing by the virtue-signaling hipsters with beards and their blue-fringed colleagues that they would leave their jobs in protest if they dared to publish a book by transphobic Julie Bindel. They all caved in, leaving me to sink into a deep depression from which I struggled to emerge. After years of being deplatformed at university debates, disinvited from events at the last minute, and often requiring a police escort at those I am allowed to attend, this felt like the final nail in the coffin of free speech, reason, and women's rights.
So, first off, Bindel compares publishing a novel by a trans person as equivalent to publishers publishing a book by a drug dealer and a murderer. So being trans is equivalent to being a murderer in Bindel's eyes? Okay, so we see more of the dehumanization of trans people there. Keep that in mind, we'll be coming back to it. But right now, I actually want to focus more on how Bindel felt that her novel not getting published was like a nail in the coffin of free speech, reason, and women's rights. Girl, you got 3 dinners from 3 separate publishing offices. Calm the fuck down. There are hundreds of unpublished authors who never even get that far. There's this underpinning that she's owed the platform at a university event. But she never acknowledges that the reason that she's no longer invited to these university events, which has happened a few times to her, has happened because of the harm her words have caused. Because how she wielded the platform that she had in order to harm others. I won't go into the entirety of Bindel's history. This article right here goes into more of it if you're curious, but suffice it to say, like Rowling, Bindel has been a champion of many harmful anti-transgender and LGBTQ in general views. She's fought against LGBTQ rights organizations like Stonewall and continually focused on and targeted trans people. And that is why it's been difficult for her to get published or speak at university events or get platformed. Not because she's a woman, not because she's not transgender, but because she is a transphobe. She is getting a similar treatment to TERF men such as Graham Linehan. Graham Linehan was also a prominent TERF who started attacking and harming trans people, and suddenly his family left him and he stopped being able to get his TV shows made. It's not because he's standing up for rights as he claims, but because he's actually harming people and people are recognizing that.
Oh, come on, you're not seriously trying to say that children going to the doctor and saying that they're worried about their gender is akin to children being experimented on in Nazi concentration camps?
I'm afraid I am.
But then he goes on television and cries that trans people took away his family.
They took everything from me, you know.
Like what? What do you mean?
They took my family, you know. You know, before this, all I was doing was, you know, writing comedy and playing board games and being silly on the internet. And then I just said, no, hang on a sec. Stop calling these women TERFs. Stop sending them abuse. Let them speak. And for that, they just destroyed me.
Sorry, Graham. We didn't take away your family. You did by being a jerk. But Bindel is doing much the same as Graham Linehan did. And this isn't Bindel's first rodeo either. At a speaking engagement at Edinburgh University, Bindel alleged that she was the victim of a sudden violent attack by a trans woman, who she described as a man, outside of the airport. But then later, she then recanted that, saying that it was actually at the university. Turns out that because of Bindel's words, hundreds of students were protesting the event, and one trans woman came up to confront Bindel just verbally, quote, so I could speak face to face with a person who has caused great harm to trans people across this country. And Bindel later recanted her statement, saying that it was actually a verbal assault. See how everything by trans people to her has somehow sort of violent connotation to it? But this didn't stop her from yelling about it all over Twitter, leading to the mass harassment of trans people online. There's this subtle assumption by all of these people, Rowling, Bindel, Graham Linehan, that they're owed these platforms, and that by taking them away, they're taking away something that they should have had, rather than it being something that was a privilege given to them. A privilege, by the way, that many trans people don't get. And the reason for this is because TERFs often see their TERFdom as synonymous with womanhood. And their TERFdom also, as we've already discussed, comes hand in hand with their place of economic privilege. There's that familiar phrase, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like an attack. So when these TERFs are not given platforms because of their views, which they see as being owed to them as people of means and privilege, and then they see trans people get those platforms, it feels tantamount to an attack on not only just their privilege, but also their personhood. Yet because they have equated their privilege in being able to express their views with their personhood and then to their womanhood, these TERFs see any critique of the harm of their views and the removal of their platforms as misogyny, because you're attacking a woman's place to speak out, without recognizing that trans women getting a platform is also women being given a platform to speak out. And there are other women who aren't gigantic, colossal transphobes who also get platforms to speak out. And they aren't owed one, and especially when they are being harmful jerks. For a trans woman like Gretchen Felker-Martin to succeed in getting her book published while they don't feels like an attack because Gretchen Felker-Martin is taking what is owed to them. It's taking up space that they see as for themselves because they're used to just getting what they want. But their privilege insulates them from seeing the harm that other people, and especially in this case trans people, face. Bindell even states in her article,
The truth is that you don't hear reports of trans activists being attacked by women, feminists or otherwise.
I'm sorry, what world are you living in? Trans people face historic levels of harassment right now. Numerous studies have shown that trans people face increasing levels of harassment and attacks, many by TERFs or fueled by TERF rhetoric that is becoming more and more mainstream. Many TERFs are known to target many trans women in online spaces. Rowling herself has targeted specific trans people numerous times on Twitter, and I talked about that in this video. On top of all this, we're seeing increasing levels of transphobia and harassment and anti-transgender legislation being pushed around the United States and the United Kingdom, in part stoked by rhetoric championed by TERFs. Many legislations have even cited Rowling herself. But TERFs say that this harassment doesn't actually happen because, one, they're insulated from it so they don't see it or don't go looking for it because it would go against their narrative, or two, they don't see this harassment as valid because it doesn't come from the same place that their womanhood does. Again, we've talked about how they only view womanhood through their experience of it. So for trans women to face harassment for our specific version of womanhood does not feel as valid to them because we aren't really women in their eyes. We could just take off the woman's suit like Buffalo Bill and then we would suddenly not have to face any harassment at all. So they have dehumanized trans people enough that they don't even care how we are treated and how that feels every day to get that harassment in online spaces in the real world and the fear that comes with it. Fear that they should understand as women. But this is one way that TERFdom often comes hand in hand with white feminism, one of many ways. But this is also why, while TERFs focus their predominant attention on trans women, their views often intersect with viewing people of color, poor women, and LGBTQ folks as less than them as well. Go into any TERF spaces and you'll find a ton of racism, classism, homophobia, and much more there as well. This does not mean that there aren't people of color or poor or LGBTQ folks in the TERF movement, but it does mean that these views are predominant within these spaces. And if you want to know more about how that comes about, the wonderful Kaylee and Conrad dives deeper into it in this video right here. But getting back to Bindell's criticism of Manhunt, the other element that Bindell focused on was the violent end that Rowling met with in Manhunt. That Rowling went out flaming, and sadly not the fun kind of flaming. Bindell chalked up this violent end to Rowling within the novel as author Felker-Martin just being a misogynist trying to enact and incite harm against Rowling. That Felker-Martin's killing off of a fictional Rowling is tantamount to an incitement of violence.
I will not stoop to their level. As a supporter of free speech, I would never call for books to be cancelled. However, I would certainly be interested to see where Felker-Martin's novel stands in relation to laws on incitement to violence. Meanwhile, I'll be curious to find out whether the bookshops that determinedly refuse to put my books and others by feminist authors on display apply the same resolution to Felker-Martin's work. We can only hope, for make no mistake. While this gruesome misogyny may be aimed at JK Rowling, this is everybody's battle to fight.
I wouldn't go so far as to say this book should be taken off the shelf, but what I will say is this woman is telling everyone to kill JK Rowling. Excuse me. So what you're saying is that she should be able to say these words, but that she doesn't deserve a platform for words that you deem harmful. But wasn't that what you said was taking away your free speech when it happened to you? This is what so many people complaining about the end of free speech really mean. They feel like they're losing the ability to speak, but what's really happening is they're losing their platform, and honestly not even that really, and because they're so used to just automatically being given a platform, they feel as if their speech is being taken away without realizing they're actually having to, for a single brief moment, speak at the same volume as other marginalized folks, instead of just being handed the megaphone that was gifted to them at birth. This is often how TERFs like to frame trans women. Not only are we harassers, but our real desire is to come into women's spaces like bathrooms or prisons or the publishing industry apparently, as predatory monsters ready to eat and attack them. Yet, in truth, this usage of Rowling in the novel isn't that. Yes, I know. I get that killing Rowling in the book is incredibly dark, and some people take issue with the death of a real-life person in a fictional work. And that's okay, not every fictional work has to be to someone's taste. This book is definitely not to everybody's taste. But killing real people in a fictional setting is a time-honored tradition in fiction, especially in horror and post-apocalypses. Many fictional stories have killed off real-world billionaires as part of their representation of the issues that they're discussing. World War Z, for example, did that in the novel in a way very similar to Manhunt, given that they're both zombie pictures. The movie Kingsman kills dozens of real-life politicians and billionaires, including then-President Obama and Bill Gates. The Infinity Gauntlet comic features Trump Tower getting knocked over, and even fucking Dante's Inferno, one of the most famed works of literature ever, featured Dante listing people he took issue with in the real world and placing them in a circle of hell. The dude had a shit list and he wanted you to know it, and keep in mind, these were people who were Dante's contemporaries. Like, at least Fletch Martin didn't say Rowling was rotting away tortured in the pits of fucking hell for all time. She just did the same thing that literally Kingsman did years ago. I get that Rowling's death is visceral, and it's not for everyone. But even if people weren't trying to argue that this killing of Rowling was tantamount to an incitement of violence, many did argue that it was in poor taste. In fact, many people compared Manhunt's killing of Rowling to something like Kathy Griffin's infamous photo shoot where she held Trump's cut-off head way back right after Trump got elected in 2016. But the comparison to my mind isn't really apt. The extreme gruesomeness of that photo that showed the visceral death of a real world public figure was controversial in a similar way to Manhunt. But my biggest issue with what Kathy Griffin did with that photo was that it didn't say anything beyond fuck Trump. Like, I get it, fuck Trump. I totally agree there. And I get that there is something worthwhile out of the catharsis that you get from saying something like that about a figure who has caused lots and lots of harm to marginalized groups. I mean, honestly, it comes from that same emotional catharsis that a kid would get writing a story where their bully gets beat up. We all fantasize about getting back at the people who have caused us trauma and harm. But Kathy Griffin said this in a way that just pissed people off and didn't say anything about it. It was just literally shock value. There are so many things to say fuck Trump for. I could literally give you a miles-long list. You don't do something like this photo shoot. You don't show something that visceral without saying something with it. Or else it just gets people angry without directing that anger in any specific way and just ostracizes the people that probably need to hear the message of fuck Trump even more. It's just like that one time that Robert De Niro said fuck Trump at the Tonys.
I'm gonna say one thing, fuck Trump.
Like, cool, I don't necessarily disagree, but are you going to add anything to that? Or are you doing it just to please the room full of your rich friends?
Fuck Trump.
is not what Manhunt does. Manhunt actually is a criticism of Rowling, and it's targeted and concise. On top of that, the novel is splatterpunk, like it's an X-rated book all the way down. I like this book quite a lot, and we'll talk about why in just a minute, but it is an incredibly gruesome novel, and Rowling's death is honestly tame compared to a lot of the rest of the book, including things that happen to trans people in it, by the way. It's literally part of the genre of this type of book. There are dozens upon dozens of books and movies and TV shows that do stuff very similar to what this book does. And to be fair, that is not to everybody's taste. This is not a book for all audiences. Believe me, I would not recommend it to everyone. But also, the body horror, like a David Cronenberg movie, is not there superfluously. It's getting at the themes of what the novel is trying to say. It is not just shock value like Kathy Griffin. So to my mind, it may not be in your taste, but I don't think it is in poor taste. Additionally though, Rowling's death in the story also serves a plot point as well. Despite her being walled off somewhere when she died, her death made her a martyr for many TERFs in the post-apocalyptic world. These TERFs build a ship named the Galbraith after Rowling's Robert Galbraith pseudonym that she uses for her detective novels, a pseudonym that is named after an anti-LGBTQ inventor of conversion therapy techniques because, again, TERFdom overlaps with homophobia. Love seeing that through line there and people gaslighting everyone saying like, oh, she just chose it just cause she didn't pick it because it was named after the dude who did conversion therapy. That's really terrible. Why pick that one? She's always talking about how she knows like really great names. You can come up with great things like Kingsley Shacklebolt, which isn't racist at all, I guess, but she can't think of a better name than the dude who did horrible conversion therapy stuff. Considering the stuff we talked about earlier with the conversion therapy law, seems a bit sus. But this martyrdom of Rowling in the novel, which is used to galvanize the TERFs in the book to go and kill more trans people, reflects how many TERFs in the real world have used the criticism that Rowling has brought upon herself, which they have claimed is harassment, to continually justify attacks on the marginalized, like trans people. On top of all of this, Bindell also likes to claim hypocrisy on the part of trans people for defending the killing of a fictional JK Rowling in Manhunt when trans people, myself included, got upset at Rowling for writing a transgender serial killer in one of her Robert Galbraith novels.
Last year, JK Rowling published Troubled Blood, one of her Cormoran Strikes series, which she writes under the pseudonym Robert Galbraith, and was immediately accused of transphobia. She had employed the simple fictional trope of allowing her killer on occasion to disguise himself as a woman to commit his crimes. Never mind that he is not the main villain of the book, nor that he is ever portrayed as trans or even called a transvestite. The howls of outrage and victimization were immediate, along with calls to boycott Rowling's work and for bookshops to withdraw it from the shelves. Where are these bleeding hearts now, when depictions of grotesque violence against women are being glorified by another author and her acolytes?
Yes, Rowling had employed a simple fictional trope of bequeathing, really, her killer to disguise as a woman. I mean, it's a time-honored trope we've seen in things like Silence of the Lambs or Psycho, because we all know that tropes are universally good, like the white savior, or fridging a woman, or using anti-Semitic stereotypes to code your fantasy goblin bankers. All these tropes are perfectly fine and above criticism, so how dare these trans people say things like, oh, she's being transphobic? How hypocritical.
Patrick is a dirty, stinky, rotten transviewer!
But seriously, the issue with Rowling using that trope of a transvestite serial killer is because it does lean into real-life stigmas surrounding trans people being seen as insane, violent, or sexually perverted. Even if the character isn't actually trans, whatever that means, considering that's what a ton of JK Rowling supporters argued that the character was, not actually trans in a way that reminded me of Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs.
Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be.
It still feeds that stigma and narrative surrounding trans people. In fact, it even feeds it more, because that's what TERFs argue that trans women are. That we are just men who aren't really trans, but are just putting on women's clothing in order to invade women's spaces to attack and harm women.
Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be. He's tried to be a lot of things, I expect.
These are all ideas that TERFs themselves don't just put into their fiction, but say trans people are in real life. So to see it in Rowling's book Troubled Blood, I'm not crying victim about it, I'm more just pointing out how it's reflective of the dehumanization that Rowling supports in real life around trans people. Not to mention that this dehumanization of trans people isn't just in one of Rowling's books, but was in other of her novels, including an earlier novel in the Galbraith series, The Silkworm. In the novel, a trans woman named Pippa Migley is depicted as violent and stalks the main character, Strike, with a knife. When Strike attempts to defend himself, references to Pippa's assigned sex at birth are made. Her prominent Adam's apple is pointed out and her rough voice is mentioned, all things to highlight how male she actually is. And Strike even tells her this.
If you go for that door one more fucking time, I'll call the police and I'll testify and be glad to watch you go down for attempted murder. And it won't be fun for you inside, Pippa. Not pre-op.
It's telling to me that the one explicit trans character in Rowling's novels is a violent person, and when they do enact that violence, the novel itself points out how gross and disgusting they are by highlighting their male features, and thereby saying that she's monstrous, subhuman, and then uses that subhumanity that they've now instilled in the reader to justify violence against trans people because it's literally in the mouth of the main character who we're following. You see how that might be reflective of ways that Rowling actually views trans people? And even if we take Rowling out of it, how trans people would have a problem with that, given that it features all the highlights of the ways that TERFs talk about us and how we need to break down these tropes around discussing trans people and let us, not always just be the violent murderer? It's not hypocrisy. We're actually applying the same critical lens that we are to Manhunt. It's called literary criticism and critique and analysis. But one is leaning into harmful stigmas, and the other is critiquing millionaires, who I think probably deserve the critique. Oh, and by the way, if we're talking hypocrisy here, I should mention that Bindell's argument of cis women suddenly not getting platform because trans people are in the publishing industry now is complete and utter bullshit. I mean, first off, not only does Bindell not talk about how many trans people in general don't get published, but just points to one trans woman getting a book as somehow removing space for all cisgender women, but also she completely misses that Rowling, the woman that she spends most of her article discussing, despite writing 3 failed novels, being a colossal transphobe, and arguably not writing anything super noteworthy since the end of the Harry Potter books, still gets published all the damn time. I mean, apparently Rowling's screenplay for Secrets of Dumbledore was so bad, they had to completely rewrite it and make the film the first film ever to have a credit of screenplay based on a screenplay by JK Rowling. That's how bad it was. They had to completely rewrite it, but God forbid Rowling doesn't get sole credit for her crap work. But even further, and this is my favorite part of the article, Bindell also admits that the book that she said she couldn't get published got published.
In fact, my story had a happy ending. My agent was then contacted by a male publisher at Little Brown, which published the book last year. It has since sold extremely well, vindicating their decision.
Wow, it looks like you can be a complete transphobe and still be wined and dined by 3 publishers, get your book published, and then complain about how silenced you are in an essay on a public platform that tons of people read. So oppressed. But again, she does hit on a kernel of truth, that women, trans or cis, face larger discrimination in getting published no matter how good or bad their work is. But instead of being willing to direct criticism where it needs to go, Bindell instead points the finger at trans people finally getting a space for ourselves as somehow pushing out real women, again, an argument that we're invading women's spaces. As if the entire publishing industry as a whole is a women's space, I guess? It speaks to, again, that privilege and entitlement. Yet this is what TERFs constantly try to frame the conversation around, as if trans women are just trying to attack TERFs all the time, who they ubiquitize as all women, even though many cis women are not TERFs, in order to misinform people and to place trans women as the aggressors. I mean, you can even see this in the subtle ways, like in how Bindel describes the novel Manhunt. She describes the story as being about trans women hunting down TERFs, when the book is actually about 5 main characters, including one of them being a TERF themselves, trying to survive in this world. A world where TERFs hunt down trans people, not the other way around. And then this misinformed framing becomes mainstream, as we see in articles like this crappy one from the New York Post, which parroted a lot of Bindel's misconstructions of the book and took many of Gretchen Felker-Martin's words on Twitter and elsewhere out of context to make Gretchen look like a solely vindictive TERF-hating trans woman who wants to murder everybody. When in truth, it's a trans woman speaking, through fiction, to the truth about the harm they, TERFs, have caused and the classist and privileged roots that underpin it. Yet, because these TERFs have so equated their womanhood with their own singular privileged experience of womanhood, they can't even differentiate between critiques on their privilege and attacks on their identity as women. So far, I've only talked about Manhunt through the lens of how TERFs have critiqued it, which amounts to only talking about a single paragraph of the book. And I think, after having read the novel, to let only TERFs dictate how this novel is discussed would be doing it a massive disservice, as well as disservice to all of us that need to hear its message. So I want to take some time at the end of this video to show how Manhunt is a critique on all the things that we've been discussing throughout this entire video, but that it does so in a way that asks the question, why? Why do TERFs do this? And why do we all treat each other this way? Because that's what the book is about, dehumanization, and how we dehumanize each other. And it does so specifically through the rhetoric of gender and TERFdom. First and foremost, the book reflects on how biology actually does affect trans people through its over-the-top testosterone post-apocalypse. If you have too much testosterone, you become horrific monsters, men that only exist
to gulp down meat in chunks like an alligator horking down a fish.
They are only there to consume flesh and rape, and the book depicts that vividly. As I spoke about earlier, that is one of the ways this book is challenging. It's so deeply visceral in its depictions of body horror and sex, a staple of the genre. Many have argued that the novel's grossness is something unique to trans people, saying that Gretchen particularly, but that trans people in general, are depraved and disgusting, while many other cisgender novel writers, like Stephen King for example, have written sequences just as gross for their own novels. I will be fair, it is a lot, and it's not for everyone, but the novel uses this visceral, nasty, disgusting, gross, grimy, viscera-filled and bodily fluid-filled world, not for gratuitous effect, to depict the fear that consumes this world and how much of that fear is centralized in the horror of our bodies. Not just the bodies of the testosterone zombies, but dysphoric trans women's fear of our own bodies. To escape the horrific fate of turning into these testosterone zombies, trans women have to survive by trying to lower their testosterone levels through drugs like spironolactone or even drinking a lot of tea, lest they become these monsters.
As she walked, she chewed licorice root on the left side of her jaw, the sickeningly sweet taste coating the inside of her mouth. Shelved Spiro was mostly useless now, ruined by sunlight, water, or simple oxidation. So licorice root, spearmint tea. Some girls ate Black Coast, but it gave Fran awful diarrhea. Winter was dangerous. The dried shit started losing potency sometime in February, usually, and even doubling up on dosage didn't always keep T-Rex at bay. 2 years ago, Fran had come down with the shakes so bad she'd begged Indy to kill her.
While most cisgender women in this post-apocalypse only have to worry about fighting off the hordes of rage virus men because their testosterone levels aren't high enough to have to be concerned about it, trans women and some non-binary people need to think about it constantly. In this way, the novel reflects the understanding in real life how no one, not even trans people, are ignoring the biological reality of our bodies. On top of that, the book even recognizes that some cisgender women who may have elevated testosterone levels, because some cisgender women do have elevated testosterone levels, would also have to worry about this as well, which highlights the fact that many TERFs often forget that not all cisgender women have the same exact biological realities as every other cisgender woman. Yet Manhunt takes this idea even further, because it understands how this reality of our understanding of our biology often places trans women in further danger. Due to dwindling resources and less things like spironolactone being available, our two lead character trans women, Beth and Fran, are forced to leave their home in order to hunt down the men that have turned into testosterone zombies, in order to cut off their junk so they can use it to create medicine in order to lower their own testosterone levels. Again, gruesome book. To be able to survive without turning into ravaged monsters, trans women in this world have to place themselves in harm's way to fight these ravenous men. It's not just about avoiding them, they have to go and directly confront them. This is a reality that many trans people in the real world have to navigate as well, a society that often is hostile to trans people, especially as misinformation and attacks against trans people continues to mount, something I spoke about in this video. Yet, having to face the testosterone monsters is something that many cisgender women, especially cisgender women of beings, can avoid in the novel's world, as we saw with the fictional version of Rowling holding herself up in her castle. Instead, the TERFs that wander the wasteland have formed a group that banded together to not only gather resources, but to hunt down trans women. Because in this world, they view trans people as simply monsters in waiting, a testosterone zombie only a few moments from bursting forth. And it comes from something that happened in the early days depicted in the apocalypse of the book.
There had always been rad femmes in New England. Enclaves of sneering middle-class white women who talked a lot about performing gender roles and appropriating lived experience. They curated incestuous little social media cells where they repeated the same 6 talking points to the same 30 other women. After T-Day, it got worse. Frank could still picture the viral video of the trans girl succumbing to the virus while under observation at St. Vincent's after bottom surgery. Her skin splitting along her shoulder blades in the camera's shaking frame. Bloody foam dripping from her chin as she lurched through a privacy curtain, and someone out of sight started to scream. She could still hear the pickup fuzzed whispers of spotless green linen against the antiseptic tile. In the year before the internet collapsed, that video had been everywhere, spreading like black mold over Twitter and Facebook. XX had slipped into the vernacular not long after, a way for cis women to signal safety to one another. A little shibboleth to ward off the specter of the wolf in women's clothing, and then, after a while, a catch icon to scrawl in Sharpie on the baseball bat you kept by your bed, or the gun under your pillow. Don't worry, citizen. I have the right chromosomes.
One trans woman's viral video becomes indicative to culture at large of all trans people, that were just monsters ready to burst forth. And TERFs in the book use it to literally justify enacting violence or preparing for violence against trans people. To the TERFs in the novel, they don't recognize the horror of that not only to anyone, but especially for trans people like Fran, who don't wish to see ourselves becoming those horrific monsters either. No, they only saw it as confirmation of what they already knew to be true, that trans women are just men underneath, just monstrous men lurking in the shape of a woman's body, ready to invade their spaces and become a ticking time bomb, ready to rape and assault and eat their flesh. Dehumanizing trans women so far, even though many trans women are just people trying to live. They forget how many dysphoric trans women fear our place in this system as well. We fear losing our identities and being forced into closeting ourselves, becoming those zombified monsters. It also leads us to fear our own bodies. I've already described how the main character, Fran, worries about becoming one of these monsters. However, she also still hates her body as it is, longing for the facial harmonization surgery she was scheduled for, but was unable to get because of the world falling into the apocalypse.
When she did sleep, she dreamed of the world that was gone, of her last few shifts at the Park Avenue Starbucks, and the sputter progress of her FFS fundraiser on Twitter. She dreamed of refreshing the page again and again, only to find donations draining away, supportive comments deleted. She dreamed of that slender, elegant face she designed with her surgeon, Dr. Hockshi. I was so close, she thought, miserably. I was so close to being a girl. The outline of the face she'd made, the one she dreamed of pulling down over her own, as though she could step into a dream and wear it waking. Leering at her through flame and melting was. Blood and gore slicked its narrow chin, and behind its perfectly arched brows and Roman nose seated great thick slabs of fat and bone and muscle, pulsing in the dark. A huge rotten man-body hiding itself behind what she would never have. The plague had snatched her finished self away. Except you wouldn't have been on your meds before or after surgery, and that beautiful face would have cracked open, and tumors would have grown behind it and eaten through it with their sharp little teeth. And then there'd be nothing left of you at all.
This passage perfectly encapsulates Fran as an incredibly dysphoric trans woman. Throughout the novel, she sees herself as not enough, as less than, as incomplete or imperfect for not being able to complete her medical transition. And this reflects in real life how trans women are currently living through our own apocalypse right now, with healthcare that could quickly alleviate our dysphoria being taken away from us through legislation, citing TERF rhetoric, or healthcare systems that see our healthcare as simply cosmetic. Or people not being able to afford healthcare at all. Because in the United States, for some reason, we believe that having healthcare is somehow something that needs to cost you every single cent that you have. But while the book is sympathetic to Fran and her dysphoria and her inferiority complex and self-doubt, it's also incredibly critical of her as well, forcing her to reconcile that she is a complete person, even despite not getting access to the care that would help her alleviate her dysphoria. Her character's arc throughout the book is to come to terms with the fact that she may never be able to complete the transition that she wanted to, and yet she still is a woman and she's still a full human being. She has to come to recognize the humanity inside of her, not the monster that society tells her that she is. But I also share that passage about Fran in the context of this essay because it points out how these expectations are placed upon all women to look a certain way, cis or trans, TERF or not. These expectations create an unhealthy relationship with ourselves, trying to live up to the ways society expects us to be, and causes us to view ourselves as inhuman, wrong, and monstrous. In Fran's case, she can't be the woman that the world tells her to be, so she considers herself not worthwhile. She invalidates her own humanity in her brain. TERFs, though, as I argued before, only filter their womanhood through their limited experience of what women can be, and don't help other women that don't fit into that small box, such as trans people, or people of color, or people without means, but instead try to use the power that they have in order to control their fear, to control the world that is outside of their control. And in order to do that, they try to eliminate anyone who doesn't fit inside their box of womanhood. You probably didn't know this about the novel because none of the TERF critics mentioned it, but one of the main characters of the book is a TERF named Ramona. And we see how she views trans women around her at one point in the book. The scene that I'm about to share with you appears after Ramona discovers a group of trans women on one of her raids out into the world outside of her enclave. And she prepares to execute them summarily. So obviously, before I share this passage, huge trigger warning. But as we listen to it, please pay attention to how this section of the book, told from Ramona's point of view, describes trans women.
You've got no fucking right.
The old woman snapped, twisting in Roman's grip. Her dark eyes flashed venom. She had a deep, scratchy voice that sounded to Ramona's untrained ear like botched vocal cord surgery. A frog's croak. Fine silver stubble dusted her long jaw, which clicked as she swallowed and continued in an urgent whisper.
They're just kids. They're just kids. If you need to make some kind of a point, keep me. Do what you're gonna do to me. But let them go.
Ramona shoved her down onto her knees beside the big, hunched brick Karen had caught. There was a real thing. Shoulders like a plow horse, hairline receding at her greasy temples, beady eyes darted nervously between the legionnaires. How could she think anyone would mistake her for a woman?
The way Ramona views trans people is seeing them as nasty and disgusting. And yet it mirrors how many TERFs describe trans women's bodies as botched, mutilated, inhuman. The following quotes aren't lines from this book. They're TERFs describing real-life trans people and our bodies.
A mutilated penis is nothing like a vagina, but then again, I expect nothing less from men who think vaginas are just holes to stick their dicks in.
It turned to doubt that the problem had come in a slightly different package. A 6 feet tall, pancake makeup blurring, a stubbled jaw, 2 breasts grafted onto a muscular torso like add-ons. There's no mistaking that this lingerie specialist was male. What would have happened if I hadn't been there? My friend asked me.
His body is a complete wreck. Those tits are huge, and I can only imagine what horrors lurk under that bra. All that skin had to stretch pretty damn quickly. They can be removed, but his genitals are completely destroyed. No, a person can only take so much before the damage overwhelms them. Maybe he can find peace in Jesus or Hare Krishna or something. Plus, he's a leftist atheist. I don't see that happening easily. Just like almost as a test of humanity, I feel like these people should be made to read back what they write aloud. Like, actually hear it said. Or, better yet, have to say it out loud themselves and hear themselves say it. And say it in front of people. And see the reactions. And hear how that sits in the air. Ugh.
One of those was literally describing me. That's how TERFs view myself and my body. This is how trans people are dehumanized. It's how I'm dehumanized. Through language that first frames us as disgusting, mutilated monsters, and then from there, making insinuations that we would attack and harm someone because we have snuck into these spaces that we're just pretending to be women, but you can really see underneath the signs of our viscera, our manhood, our disgusting, zombified selves. And so if that's what trans people are, violence against us becomes justified. Another big trigger warning for this passage here.
The squad, her squad, pushed, dragged, and shoved the women, the prisoners, into a rough line near the back steps of the house. The kitchen light was on. The old transsexual had gone silent. Her eyes were dry, her chin thrust out, her lip peeled back in withered scorn. The other prisoners huddled close around her, den mother. To Ramon's other side, the women drew their mispatched pistols. She centered the old woman's mutinous expression, that cruel hatchet of a face, not one of the crying girls who weren't really there, who weren't 17 or 22, who weren't crying snotty tears on one another. Just breathe through it, she said. That's not a woman, it's not your sister. It's just a man in disguise. We let it go, sooner or later it's going to come out of its skin. Her dry mouth, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. It's going to hurt us, rape us, eat us, if it can. Aim, said Molly. The guns came up. Pigs. The old woman screamed, spit flying, the breezing tugging at her fine white hair. Fucking Gestapo. She began to squeeze, or Karen did. Fire.
I meant it when I said that there's truth in what Manhunt is saying. Hard, difficult, but real truths. That passage is the logical endpoint of TERFism. I've already done a whole video on how TERF ideology is ultimately one that leads to, or at the very least supports, authoritarian fascist ones like the one we see created in Manhunt. And I want you to know that I don't say that idly. So many people are ready to call each other Nazis nowadays that it's lost all meaning, but I'm not kidding here. Many TERFs call for violence against trans people because that's what their ideology paints us as deserving. Lily Cade, for example, is a TERF who called for the lynching of all trans women.
Trans women are men. They know they are men. If these men can't slit the throats of these vile personas in public, admit what they have done, take off the dress, look with abject shame upon the affront to God and nature they have wrought in the service of their masturbatory fantasies, apologize for the children they have hurt with their lies and their drugs and their grooming, apologize for the incarcerated women they have fed to rapist monsters, apologize for the lesbian spaces they have desecrated, and devote the rest of their lives to repairing the damage they have done. If you left it up to me, I'd execute every last one of them personally. Trans women are vile, weak, disgusting, whiny, fake victim masturbators who should be ashamed of themselves. They threatened suicide and you rolled over. You disgust me too. There is but one noble response to a man who tries to use the threat of violence against himself to manipulate a woman's emotions. Fucking do it then. Trans women are men, trans women are evil, trans women are rapists, trans women are predators, trans women are men who have surrendered to their shadow. That's what it means to be evil. Cancel the ever-living fuck out of this. Cancel this so hard that no man dare walk the path of the trans women in public ever again. Enough is enough. Lynch Caitlyn, lynch the sisters Wachowski, lynch Laura Hubbard, lynch Fallon Fox. Make these men stand up as the men you all know they are and hold them accountable for their shame. Your fear of the truth has shoveled thousands of children down the hole in Buffalo Bill's basement so he can harvest them for their skins. Enough is enough.
The ideology, the verbiage, the dehumanization, the seeing of trans people as just testosterone zombie monsters ready to burst forth, is just placed into a fictional post-apocalypse and played out as it naturally would. Unless you think this is one random woman who has gone too far, listen to how actual lawmakers who have used TERF rhetoric describe trans people using that same rhetoric.
I think it's straight evil. First off, if I was a parent and my 5th grade daughter had to sleep and shower in some kind of cabin at some summer camp that I paid money to send my child to, and there was a man calling himself a woman sleeping in her cabin, showering with her, that guy he'd be in jail. He would be in jail. Well, first off, my husband would have beat him into the ground, and then he'd be in jail. But this is exactly how we need to stand up against this stuff. And then the men, this guy, Leah Thompson, I'm sorry, that's William, and he's not a she, he's a he. He should not be competing in women's swimming. Anytime he wins, he did not win. Whoever came in second place, the real girl in the race, she's the winner. He should be thrown out of swimming completely. All of the men, I do not care about. It shouldn't matter about what they do in their bedroom. If they want to wear a dress, fine. But what they're doing is they are defeating women. It's about beating women down, and the left stands up for it. And this is where America needs to say enough. Most Americans agree that this is wrong, and it's absolutely ridiculous. And I don't know why Fox News or anyone else goes along with the whole pronouns, the he's and the she's and whatever. These are men. We need to call them what they are. They're men. That makes them a he, a him, and not play this pronoun game anymore.
Some of y'all still want to try and find political compromise with those that want to groom our school-aged children and pretend men are women, etc. I think they need to be lined up against a wall before a firing squad to be sent to an early judgment.
It's fear. Fear that lies at the heart of all of this. At the heart of TERFs. They see trans women as these monsters underneath, not seeing our humanity. But also, we are a fear that they can beat. In the novel, the biggest fear TERFs should have is the literal raid zombies that infest the entire world. But to the TERFs, they're just normal. Part of the world now. Something dangerous yet, but part of the new natural order of things. They've normalized living in this testosterone apocalypse. They don't have the power to kill all men. But trans people? Trans people can be exterminated, eliminated, or stomped out. In real life, TERFs often understand the harm patriarchal systems place upon women because, as I've said before, they are women and have faced harassment and misogyny in our society today that every single woman faces in some way, shape, or form. Many have also probably faced abuse and sexual assault, and it's absolutely horrid, and I would not wish that upon anyone, despite the fact that they would wish it upon me. But to them, patriarchy is so overwhelming. It's this thing that they can't really ever beat. So instead, in their mind, they've normalized it, and they frame trans people as the biggest threat to them, as these boogeymen ready to come in and attack them, because we're a boogeyman that can be defeated, or a monster that can ultimately be overcome. Because these patriarchal systems and TERFs have been so normalized, trans people become the monsters in the night that they can fight. The antagonists of their story because we're antagonists that they can beat and control, rather than the ubiquitousness of the patriarchy symbolized by the testosterone zombies. You can't destroy the system, but you can kill the people that make living in the system a little bit more uncomfortable for you. Push them all out so there's a little bit more for you to eke out, instead of working with those people to try and tear down the system as a whole. Instead of realizing that trans people are their natural allies that could help them defeat all these zombies, instead of realizing that trans people in the real world are your allies as women in the fights against harm that all women face, TERFs instead direct their anger and fear and vitriol at trans people. That's what this novel constantly gets at, fear. Gretchen Felker-Martin has a deep sympathy for how this fear of our bodies and ourselves and our place in this horrific world dominates our lives, and how attempts to control that fear lead to harm to not only others, but also to ourselves. Even for TERFs. In the novel, Ramona begins to suffer PTSD for killing trans people, literally vomiting in a bathroom after that execution scene that I described earlier. Yet she knows that if she steps out of line and reveals her unwillingness to kill trans people, the harm that it's caused her, she'll be seen as a traitor to the cause. She'll lose her community, her friends, the people that care about her, supposedly. So she puts on a smile and a happy face, and reflects on many TERFs in real life need the community that TERFdom gives them. It gives them community and a sense of belonging, all based on hatred and anger and fear. So we see many people radicalized today. Many white supremacists join white supremacist groups because it gives them a community. But it's a community that is deeply harmful to not only others, but to the people in it as well. As a result, Ramona in the book becomes symbolic of a much more complex villain, and this understanding is there to humanize her, but it is not there to excuse her. Gretchen Felker-Martin wrote about writing this TERF character.
The challenge of writing about human monsters is that you have to confront the ways in which they're exactly like you are. Most of them care about their loved ones, hold genuine ideals they believe in their hearts are necessary for the maintenance or creation of a just world, and go about their lives with little to distinguish them from anyone else. Even people who day after day engage in heinous acts of violence and oppression come home and behave much as anyone else would. The vast ideological and moral gaps between us are in actuality the product of infinitesimally fragile factors. With Ramona, I wanted to bring that realization home to a place where the attentive reader couldn't miss it, to show someone who takes the easy way out of personal conflicts, who doesn't honor or respect the people she loves or desires when those feelings run up against hard questions, who fails in ways we've all failed, but in a situation with much higher stakes. In the end, even spending the better part of half of a year thinking about what makes TERF tick didn't make me feel sympathetic towards their cause. It didn't result in my opening up my heart or reaching out to bridge the vast cultural gap between myself, my loved ones, and the people who, while they might admit it only on rare occasions, want us dead or institutionally brainwashed. In a time when civility is prized above principles and the endless refrain of both sides can be heard at all hours of the day, thinking long and hard about what TERFs want and how they go about pursuing it, about their humanity, their connections, their belief in the righteousness of their own cause, only made me feel more secure than ever in portraying them as the deranged and vicious fascists that they are.
We can understand where Ramona and TERF's ideals come from. We can have an understanding of their humanity. Ramona in many ways suffers because she's not allowed to be insulated from the harm of TERF ideology. While someone with means like Rowling gets to hide away in her castle, Ramona has to live on the front lines, sees how the version of womanhood she's trying to force everyone else to live up to isolates her from the one she loves and kills people as well. The womanhood she's trying to emulate isn't hers either. All of us, every single woman, trans or not, every single person is different. And that's okay. But the expectation to live up to a version of womanhood that TERFs that lead these movements have made synonymous with their privilege, no one can ever live up to that. You'll never be rich enough, white enough, feminine enough, butch enough, lesbian enough, straight enough, because it's not real. Yet ultimately, while we can sympathize with these people that push this ideology, we have to learn that we can't hold respect for anyone who lessens the humanity of anyone who isn't like them. Someone who would justify violence against someone else just for being who they are. But Gretchen Felker-Martin walks it in Manhunt, and she walks it well. And by the way, there is so much more to this book that I haven't even talked about. I barely mentioned the trans man character, who is often seen as a gender traitor or sexualized in the book, nor did I discuss the cis woman doctor who faces dehumanization due to her race. There's a shit ton in this book and you should 100% read it. The horror, fear, and empathy that she shows and the line that she draws at what is unacceptable is truly masterful. This book exposes the rot that lies inside our society. And it also exposes the humanity that still can be found within it. We just have to make sure not to mistake that humanity for monsters, and recognize what the true monstrosities around us are. Alrighty everyone, thank you so much for watching this video, and yes, you knew the zombie makeup had to come back at some point. I had too much fun doing it not to bring it back for the end. But seriously, thank you so much for watching this video. It really does mean a lot to me, and as I teased at the beginning of this video, I do have actually a few special announcements about some really cool stuff that's coming up on this channel, as well as a personal announcement that I'm also really excited about. So first and foremost, let me start with the personal announcement. If you are on my Patreon or you watched one of my live streams a little while back, you already know this information, but something really, really cool happened to me. As many of you know, a few months ago, my facial harmonization surgery, sometimes known as facial feminization surgery, though I don't like using the feminization term anymore because feminization, what does it mean? What is feminine and all that jazz? But regardless, that surgery got pushed back due to COVID. But I recently got some news that it was pushed up because someone canceled theirs and I got to go into their slot. So my surgery is actually scheduled for early June, and I am so excited about it because it marks the last part of the things that I wanted to do for my transition. I'm just so excited about it. But because of that, I'm actually going to be spending early June conked out recovering from surgery, and I actually want to make sure that I take time for myself to take a break and actually take the time I need to recover and relax and actually enjoy a little bit of the summer, because Jessie's a workaholic and I haven't really given myself much of a break and I want to avoid burnout. So that being said, the announcement about this channel is actually a good one, because over the next few weeks between now and the end of June, I have some of the biggest projects that I've ever been working on coming for this channel. Not only was there this video, but my next 3 videos are some of the biggest that I feel I have ever done. First and foremost, I have 2 videos, part 1 and part 2, surrounding James Gunn, an analysis of James Gunn's work through the themes of masculinity and de-radicalization. I am such a big fan of James Gunn's filmmaking, especially his recent TV show Peacemaker. It was one of my favorite superhero things in media ever, and I had a lot to say about it, and it's going to be a really exciting 2-part video that I spent a lot of time writing with my friend Aaron, so please check out those 2 videos. They'll be coming out over the course of May and into June. And then the ultimate pièce de résistance is coming towards the end of June, which is my Sex in Star Trek Part 2 video. This video, I'll be honest, has spiraled a little bit out of my control because it is now a extremely long, several-hour video that has multiple contributions from many of your favorite YouTube people that I'm not going to name here because I want it to be a little bit of a surprise, but the video is going to have a ton of really cool people in it, and it honestly, I've spent so much time, so many resources, so much of my effort writing and practicing and getting everything ready for this video. I honestly think it might be my best video I've ever done, and I am so excited about it. And like I said, that is going to be coming out towards the end of June. I'm hoping to finish it off before I actually go in for surgery, but then release it a little bit after surgery as part of like my excitement for healing up. So be on the lookout for those videos. Like I said, the next few weeks are going to be some of my best weeks yet, and I'm so excited to share those videos with you. But then after that, I'm going to take about a few weeks to a month-long break after my surgery in order to really rest up, recover, and enjoy the summer that I want to spend most of inside because I'm gonna be healing from all my head wounds. But I just wanted to announce all of that to you so that the expectations were set going forward. But even beyond that stuff, I actually have video ideas set for beyond my taking a relaxation for surgery, and I'm really excited for some of the stuff that I'm going to be doing on this channel, as well as Nebula and stuff like that. So I just want to say thank you so much to my patrons for allowing me to do this, to be able to take a break. One of the unfortunate things with YouTube is it encourages you to constantly work in order to make money and help support yourself. And because this is my full-time job, I often feel that expectation. But one of the ways that I'm able to avoid that is because of all the wonderful support of my patrons. Like 90% of the money that I make comes from there. You help pay my bills, you allow me to take breaks, you allow me to relax. So if you're a patron, thank you so much. And if you want to become a patron, please consider doing so because it really does help me out. You get yourself cool perks like your name in videos and stuff like that, and supporting me doing crazy weird videos like this one and also the big ones that I have coming up. So again, thank you patrons. Mwah. It means so much to me for you supporting me doing this work. To being a weird dork can make zombie makeup on camera, so thank you for that. Also, just a couple of quick other things. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe because I talk about LGBTQ issues through nerddoms and geekdoms. That's all the stuff that I do here as well, and I also talk about Star Trek and stuff like like that. But then on top of that, I also have a secondary channel called Jessiegender After Dark, where I do news, reviews, and reactions, including my reviews of every episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is coming out right now, as well as things like the Obi-Wan Star Wars show and stuff like that, because I'm a huge nerd and I like to talk about those things. And then on top of that, I also have a podcast called Jumpgate that I do with the wonderful Vera Wild of the Council at Geeks channel, where she and I rewatch every single episode of Babylon 5. Me for the second time in my life, because I watched it as a kid and loved it, and her for the first time ever. So we kind of have two different perspectives. It's a really fun time and a really cool science fiction show to discuss. And as I mentioned before, I am also available on Nebula, so you can go support me over there if you want to see me over on Nebula, because that also is a good way to help me pay the bills. But beyond all of that, I just thank you so much for watching this video. Like I said, I know I got into some hard and difficult topics, but I hope I at least made it a little bit fun, as much as I could for some of the darker stuff that we're talking about. But I just want to say to all of you, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for supporting me. Thank you so much, even on top of all of that, for being you, for being amazing, for being wonderful, and hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Now I gotta go eat some TERF flesh. Here we go. I know I've used this song once before, but I like it so much, so here's some more. I just want to say to my Patreons, I love you so much, and here's the song to say thank you. If it's the beat. Alex Miller, Alicia Strice, Ali Gober, Annie with an I, Ish Indra, Ashley Allenbo, Kiki Yo, Barbaruski, Beatrix Pruvis, Bella Lugosi, Blue, Blueberry Hill, Boyd and Mary Bethero, Casual Observer, Catherine Lambeth, Celestial Dawn, Chloe Dollar, Chris Boodley, Crit, Facts, Cyber Quaker, D. Casaray, Dominic Noble, Drew Betch, Alicia Tativi, Elizabeth Christensen, Elijah M, Ish the Mad, Farangato, Felicia Toast, Flynn, G-Man 42, Hacker Men, Here Reeses, Holly Walters, James Hodge, James Krivda, Jason Nutt, Jedi Indiana Jones, Jemption, Jennifer Fuss, Jenny Mabel, Jessica Wright, Joe Herman Holt, John Witherby, Joseph Dewey, Julie Mason, Justine, Kaylis, Kara Erin Foss, Kevin Froteg, Laura Demerol, Leoetha Boyd, Lily Gray, Luna T, Lysa, Maeve, Maggie the Goblin, Matt Chung, Meadow Whisperer, Melinda Walters, Melody Ann Winters Good, Mary Mello, Michael Godey, Miranda Janelle, Maureen the Pirate Queen, Nathan Steele, Nathil Fraughton, Nikki Gordon Bloomfield, Odd Just Odd, Peter Landers, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Randy Thompson, Sarah Bystam, Sarah Lemerow, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, Sasha M, Sean Piper, Shield Maiden 44444, Sky Skinner, Sonia Nero Perdo, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Steven Richardson, Steven Clenard, Strawberry Pup Tart, Super Desi, Stillrester Ratto, Tiffany Danger, Transit Toronto, Troy Stull, Ulysses the Pagan, Verdux Kai, Vincent Ellington, W. Randy, EED, Wellington Marcus, Wendell Zabizzle, William Stewart, Zoe Kerr, Zone 1 Librarian. Thank you so much to all of you, my patrons. And one final note to wrap up on. I did recently learn that sadly one member of my patron community sadly passed away recently. So for one final time, I just wish to say thank you so much to Eva Kniva for all that you gave me and all the support that you gave me. It meant the world to me, and I send you, and especially your family right now, some love.